and living out these values through worship, reflection, connection, and service. We're all invited to coffee and conversation in the Sims room after worship, back here. Those wanting to remain with those who are masked are encouraged to enjoy their conversation here in the pews. Now, Reverend Heather has a special announcement.
First, a moment of housekeeping. Just a friendly reminder that our protocol is that until the kids go to religious education classes, please wear a mask. This Sunday, it begins a series of important events related to the vision articulated by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. First, I'd like to thank all those who brought supplies today benefiting the guests of the Malden Warming Center. If you're unable to bring donations, if you're in a place to give money instead, we invite you to give generously in today's offering, as we will share the plate with the Warming Center. Later in our service, we will rededicate a Black Lives Matter banner, replacing the last one stolen from our front steps. Please plan to sing with a full heart. Our January Love and Action service opportunity is bringing today's donations to the MLK Day of Service event at the high school tomorrow morning and packing the truck bound for the Warming Center. So far, I've heard from 2 people willing to participate. If you can be here at 10 a.m. tomorrow or can come later to the high school to assist preparing the shipment, please let me know at social hour. Tomorrow, there will be a community rededication of our banner, part of the main stage event of the MLK Day of Service at the Winchester High School cafeteria, beginning at 10:30 a.m. Come as a witness or let me know if you'd like a brief part in the ceremony. Afterwards, all who can are invited to participate in the service project. Later that day, we will install our new banner in front of our building at 1:15, technology willing. This moment will be live streamed. Those on our highlights list should have received an email detailing these opportunities to engage in social witness and to promote social justice. Please see me with any questions. Thank you for being the generous and justice-loving people that you are. And now let us open our hearts and minds to the spirit of worship with these words. This is a congregation that gathers in faith, not faith in one God or in any one way. We gather in faith of the power of diversity, the power of love, and the hope of a world transformed by our care. We gather in faith in ourselves and those around us, not a faith that requires perfection or rightness in one another, rather a faith that in our shared imperfection we may learn to stumble and fall together, faith that we will help one another and to rise and to try again and again. Grateful for the faith we share, come, let us worship together.
We now invite Gordy McIntosh, Standing Committee Co-Chair and member of the Racial Justice Planning Group, to come forward to light the chalice. With humility and courage born of our history, we are called as Unitarian Universalists to build the beloved community, where all souls are welcome as blessings, and the human family lives whole and reconciled. With this vision in our hearts and minds, we light our chalice. Please rise in body or in spirit to join in singing hymn number 118 in the gray hymnal, This Little Light of Mine.
I would like to invite all of the children and anyone else young at heart who would like to come forward for a story. Wow, look at all of these beautiful faces this morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, new people. So great to see you all here. Whoa, we have so many people. This is so fun. Find a seat. I see Ryan and Neil are here. We missed you guys. So good to see your faces. Let's see. We've got Zara. We've got new friends, Piper and Ken, and we've got Valerie, who's also a new friend. Wow, we got so many people. Okay, oh, and Cassidy. Let's not forget Cassidy. I can't forget Cassidy. She's my granddaughter. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about a guy named Martin Luther King. Has anyone heard that name before? Yeah, of course we have. He's a super important guy, right? Yeah, he was a minister, much like Reverend Heather is our minister, for a church down in Georgia, which is a state in America down in the South. And so he was someone that, in Spirit Play, we would call a hero. In our UU sources, we call it a prophetic person, who is someone who helps us see what's right and tells us how to fix things that are not right. No, thank you. So he was alive and helping fix what was wrong in the South in the 1950s and 60s. And what he was trying to fix was what was injustice, which was what was not right for black people in that time. He went to a lot of protests to try and fix the things that were wrong for black people, who he called Negro people. We don't use that term anymore, but we're going to read some of his letter, a very famous letter, and he uses that term, so I wanted you to understand that's why we're using that term. Piper, did you have a question? Oh, a letter? Yeah, well, we'll see if we can open them or not. I bet Mom would know exactly the answer to that. You have another one too? Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to talk about this specific letter. Okay. So, so a lot of the ideas that he worked for, Martin Luther King worked for, are still important today. He fought for equality, and he fought for black people to have justice. And today, we still are fighting for people to have equality. And the Black Lives Matter movement is a movement to make sure that black people get justice, right? So those are all still really important ideas. And so it's important to remember Martin Luther King and everything that he did to get us to where we are today, and to understand what we still have to do to make his vision of equality something that happens all the time in our world, okay? So one of the most important things that he did was he organized nonviolent protests. Does anyone know what a protest is? Yes, Sarah. Right, you all sort of stand up together, right, and say this is wrong. Ken, did you have an idea? Go down streets with signs, exactly. Emily. Right, so you're not using violence like throwing things or hurting people or anything like that. You're just using your voices. Jeremiah.
What they did, some of the things they did was cool, so everybody knows this. Whoa, but they also went on strike because of buses.
They went on strike, that's right.
Shoot a single gun.
Not a single gun, and they won. Beautiful. It's a great story. Yeah, that's why we keep telling it. It's an amazing story, right? Okay, so yeah, so like Jeremiah was saying, they weren't allowed to go certain places. Like they couldn't be in the same place on a bus as white people, right? The black people had to be in a different place, right? Like in the back, yeah.
And before that, black people weren't allowed, but then
Yeah.
this husband had
That's the guy we're talking about, the guy with the black skin. And he said, stop riding the bus. That's right, Piper. You guys know all this stuff. You should come up here and I'll sit there. What do you think? All right, so, all right, that was just a joke. I didn't really mean it. All right, so I'm trying to explain a little funny word that they used back then that we don't use much anymore. The word was segregation. Can you guys say that word? Segregation. And it's a fancy word, and Martin Luther King used a lot of fancy words, but it's a fancy word that means separated. So it means that black people had to be separate from white people in things like restaurants, lunch counters, buses. What's that? Planes? Yep. All of that stuff. Exactly. Yeah. So here's what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you a couple things, and then Rebecca, Riley, and Celia are going to help us by reading some things from this very important letter that Martin Luther King wrote. Okay? So Martin Luther King went to Birmingham. He was invited because they were doing a lot of protesting there, okay, about segregation, about having to be separate. They didn't like it, and they wanted it to stop. And they were protesting nonviolently to have it stop. And they invited Martin Luther King because he was really well known. He was super famous. Everybody in the country knew who he was. But not everybody in the country knew what was going on in Birmingham. And they knew, the people in Birmingham, that if the country knew what was happening there, they wouldn't stand for it. That they would say, that's not right, and they would help them make it better. So Martin Luther King agreed to come and help them bring attention to these protests. When he was there, he got arrested and put in jail just for protesting nonviolently. Because of the segregation. So he, when he was in jail, read a letter. Well, he read a statement from a lot of other ministers, like Reverend Heather and like Martin Luther King. They were all ministers. But these ministers were all white, and they complained about the protests in Birmingham, even though things were really unfair there. And so Martin Luther King was in jail, and he was mad and upset and hurt about the statement that these ministers had made, and he decided to write a letter back. And so Riley's going to read the first part of that letter.
While confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my activities unwise and untimely. You are men of goodwill, and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, so I want to answer your statement in patient and reasonable terms.
So you can hear that Martin Luther King uses some big words, right? So if there's a word that you don't understand, Riley and Rebecca and Celia are going to try and make it obvious in the way they read it, what it means. But if you don't get it, raise your hand and say, what's that mean? And we'll try to explain it to you, okay? Did anybody have a word in that they didn't understand? Untimely means it's not the right time, right? Okay? So he wrote that as the beginning of his really famous and important letter. And in the letter, he goes on to talk about four main important things in response to what the ministers complained about. So first of all, like it says in what Riley read, they said it wasn't the time for it. Black people should wait for a better time to protest. And so Rebecca's going to read a little bit about that from his letter.
For years now, I've heard the word wait. This wait has almost always meant never. When you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty amidst the affluent society, when you find your tongue twisted as you explain to your 6-year-old daughter that she cannot go to the amusement park that is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience.
Yes. Smothering. Smothering means when you can't breathe, you're so closed in that it's hard to breathe. Right. Oh, well, being smothered in gym might be a little bit more fun, but yeah, smothering in general is not fun. Okay. Or nail. Okay, so now, let's see, we just read that. So when you really want something, is it easy for you to wait for it? Raise your hand or stand up if you ever found it hard to wait for something you really wanted. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, me too. Me too. Stand up if you want. Go ahead. Adults, go ahead and stand up if you want to. Okay. All right. So you can imagine how black people felt when they're told to wait for things, really important things, like letting your daughter go to an amusement park. That's no fun. That's terrible, right? Yeah, that's no good. So, oh, well, that's a whole other thing, right? Yeah. So Martin Luther King also wrote in his letter about injustice. So Celia's going to talk about injustice that black people faced every day.
So, Martin Luther King Jr. points out the injustices that black people face every day. I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. It is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed.
That's a lot of words. Piper. Oppressed means when you're smothering in a cage, when you're not able to do the things, when you're kept separate. Right. Right. Okay, so now I'm going to keep going because we got to get back to RE classes and the rest of the service. So Martin Luther King was disappointed in these ministers for saying these things in their statement. And I'm sorry, I'm missing. So he was disappointed, and he said that he thought they had shared the same ideals as him. And I'm just going to read this one. It says, "You deplore demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement fails to express the same concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations." So he was saying, that's not fair, and I'm disappointed that you don't see how bad it is here. So stand up or raise your hand if you felt disappointed in someone who said they were going to do something and then didn't do it. Yeah. So at the end, Martin Luther King writes, "One day we will know that when these children sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the world and the American dream and our most sacred values." So I wonder what Martin Luther King would think of standing up for racial justice and equality for all people in our community today. Let's think of that when we rededicate our Black Lives Matter flag at the end of the service. And for now, let's ask our grown-ups to sing us to RE classes. The words are in your order of service.
Quick question to our tech deck. Are we live streaming now? Yes, we had a tech issue earlier. Hello, live streaming friends. I hope you found us. We now enter into a centering time in our service, beginning with a responsive reading It's printed in your order of service, and for folks at home, it will appear on your screen. For the folks here in the sanctuary, I will read the words in standard type, and you're invited to respond with the text in italicized type. At home, please, if you are reading in your own space, read every other line. After the meditation, we'll take part in a ritual, kindling of the light, a time to light a candle here or at home in recognition of a joy, sorrow, or concern you hold within. During the kindling of the light, if you'd like a candle brought to you here in the sanctuary, please raise your hand and I will bring that to you. After we kindle the light, we'll be together in a time of shared silence, out of which we will sing hymn 199 in the gray hymnal, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, a favorite of Dr. King. Let us begin the responsive reading. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny. There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted. We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds which precipitate and perpetuate war. We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means.
This morning's reading is by Unitarian Universalist minister Aisha Ansano. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a radical. He was called the most dangerous man in America by the FBI and had a 17,000-page FBI file at the time of his death. It wasn't just KKK members or those in positions of power who disagreed with him or hated him. As Cornel West explains in his book, The Radical King, by the time of King's death, most of the country didn't like him. There was intense FBI pressures, including attempts to make him commit suicide, West reminds us. The black civil rights leadership was trashing him. The white establishment had rejected him. The young black revolutionaries were dismissing him. Over the course of his life, King was not a man who was loved by most. In fact, he was hated by a select few. He was an incredibly maligned man by the time he died, and yet we never talk about that. Instead, we praise and honor him and hold him up to the highest standard of the struggle for justice. We as a society measure all who struggle for justice against Dr. King, but not against who he actually was. We measure those who struggle for justice against who we have decided Dr. King was, a sanitized version of the actual man. As a society, we tell activists that their protests are too unruly, their demands too harsh, their voices too strident, their methods too stringent. We have decided as a society that there is one way to struggle for justice, and it's the way we like to imagine Dr. King struggled for justice, even though it is not the way he actually did.
And if he should die, take his body and cut it into little stars. He will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night. These beautiful words from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet so eloquently describe a radiant life. He entered the stage of history just 39 years before, and in the brief years that he was privileged to act on this mortal stage, he played his part exceedingly well. His death was a result of a sensitive religious spirit. His crime was that he dared to live his faith. He placed himself alongside the disinherited. These words are not my own. They were spoken by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as people gathered in Selma's Brown Chapel to remember the life and legacy of a martyr, a minister murdered because he chose to take a stand against injustice. This passage was the beginning of King's eulogy for the Reverend James Reeb. After making a few small changes, this passage now also reflects the death and life of the minister offering the eulogy. In today's first reflection, excerpts from King's letter from a Birmingham jail remind us of his prophetic vision. Indeed, when we pay close attention to his words, the profile of a radical advocate for change emerges. Through preservation of King's writings and speeches, his passionate indictment of the entwined forces of racism, violence, and poverty are forever accessible. These critiques, like my edits of Reeb's eulogy, need only a few adaptations to be relevant now. As a minister who has written many eulogies, I know the task of a eulogy is to speak to what theologian James Luther Adams calls intimacy and ultimacy. We seek to tell the story of the deceased and their life, but also to name what greater meaning can be found through the reality of them having lived and that life coming to an end. As I do not think King and Reeb knew each other personally, King's eulogy speaks more to the ultimacy of Reeb's martyrdom. For this year's reflection on Martin Luther King's legacy, I draw selections of Reeb's eulogy and respond from this moment in history. I'm grateful to Marcy, today's worship associate, and Patty Shepard, Maida Rodriguez-Howard, and Gloria Legvold for reading the eulogy passages. First, some context. When King and other Black activists faced horrific violence while seeking voting rights in Alabama, King invited clergy to come to Selma. In this way, King affirmed, "All America will testify to the fact that the struggle in Selma is for the survival of democracy everywhere in our land." James Reeb was one of the ministers who answered King's call. 4 men attacked him and 2 other colleagues when they left a restaurant. All 4 were tried and acquitted. Reeb's murder is officially unsolved. While James Reeb died in Alabama, his death is a local story. It is local in terms of identity. He was a Unitarian Universalist minister. Reeb and his family lived in nearby Roxbury. Reeb was not the only martyr in the Selma civil rights struggle. Not long before, a state trooper shot a local Black man, Jimmy Lee Jackson. His death further motivated activists to march from Selma to Montgomery. The Reverend Richard Leonard describes Reeb's memorial in his journal. He notes in part, "The memorial service had been scheduled for 2 o'clock. Brown Chapel was full, but there was no sign of Dr. King. The temperature in the church continued to mount. At 3 o'clock, Dr. King arrived amid cheers outdoors and then in the church. Many faiths had come to pay tribute to the memorial to Jim Reeb. There was a certain uplift that came from the broad spectrum participating in this ecumenical service. When King began to speak, it suddenly seemed right that we should all be there. King began, and if he should die, take his body and cut it into little stars. He will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night." Later, King states,
we are compelled to ask the question, who killed James Reeb? He was murdered by a few sick, demented, and misguided men who have the strange notion that you express dissent through murder. There is another haunting, poignant, desperate question we are forced to ask this afternoon that I asked a few days ago as we funeralized James Jackson. It is the question, what killed James Reeb? James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician who has moved down the path of demagoguery, who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the brutality of every law enforcement agent who practices lawlessness in the name of the law. He was murdered by the timidity of the federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam, yet cannot protect the lives of its own citizens seeking constitutional rights.
Dr. King, you speak of racism not as individual prejudice, but as part of the corruption of institutions, of systems. This is what we now call critical race theory. There are places throughout the nation where to even discuss this simple yet compelling understanding in schools is against the law. As there are times I am silent while also holding positions of privilege, I hear your rage and your sense of betrayal. We hear you. You also say,
I hope we can also find some consolation in the great affirmations of religion, which tell us that death is not the end. Whether we call it immortality of influence, somewhere there is something in our faith that reminds us that death is not a period which ends this great sentence of life, but a comma that punctuates it to a loftier significance. Let this daring faith, this great invincible surmise, be our sustaining power during these trying days.
there is a saying, the preacher preaches what they most need to hear. When did you know that, like Reeb, you would die before the age of 40? When did you come to understand the immortality of influence? And did it lend you sustaining power in your hardest moments? I found an audio recording of your eulogy for James Reeb. If it were better quality, we would be hearing it now. But through the static, I can hear the spiritual fatigue and sorrow in your voice. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light.
In spite of the tensions and uncertainties of this period, something profoundly meaningful is taking place. Out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. Doors of opportunity are gradually being opened. Those at the bottom of society, shirtless and barefoot people of the land, are developing a new sense of somebodyness, carving a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of despair.
There are elements of this time that you might never even imagine, but reaction to movement forward has been brutal. I often turn to words by a contemporary, Akaya Winwood, who similarly affirms that the cycle of birth, growth, decline, and death is a natural metaphor for what is happening on the global political stage. We need every single one of us, those who revolt, those who restore, and those who dream and create the futures we're committed to. Let's insist on remembering that we all are kin, and that repairing the world is both our birthright and our responsibility. We can and will do this, I know, for I've seen the future, and it includes all of us. Both you and she give me hope.
The greatest tribute that we can pay to James Reeb is to continue the work he so nobly started, but could not finish because his life was cut off at an early age. We have the challenge and charge to continue.
As your life would be cut off at an early age, we have inherited the work you so nobly started. Today, we recall that challenge and that charge.
So we thank God for the life of James Reeb. We thank God that he was willing to lay down his life in order to redeem the soul of our nation. So I say, so Horatio said as he stood over the dead body of Hamlet, "Good night, sweet prince. May the flight of angels take thee to thy eternal rest."
In his memoir, Richard Leonard remembers the conclusion of the memorial. "We rose to sing 'We Shall Overcome' yet one more time, and close to 1,000 voices united in a mighty chorus. The verse, black and white together, took on a deeper meaning for us as we thought of Jimmie Lee Jackson and James Reeb united in the democracy of death. As we hummed a final chorus, the Hebrew prayer for the dead was intoned and then translated for us with its phrase, 'Peace for all with justice.'" Martin Luther King's eulogy for James Reeb was also prophetic in the sense that it anticipated the future. The national response to the murder of a white clergyman put significant pressure on federal leadership to force change. Although both Jimmie Lee Jackson and James Reeb were killed, Reeb's white life seemed to matter more to the nation than Jackson's black one. Richard Leonard recalls Selma citizens circled around their televisions as, on the evening of Reeb's memorial, President Johnson urged Congress to help him pass a new voting rights bill. Everyone in the room where we had stood throughout was crying, men and women, old and young, black and white. As we know, the Voting Rights Act passed. Research reveals that it successfully increased voter turnout, registrations, in particular among black people. It has been linked to greater public goods provision for areas with a higher black population. As we also know, the Voting Rights Act was greatly weakened in 2021. King spoke these words about Reeb, but they apply to King as well. In his death, he says something to each of us. We must substitute courage for caution. We must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murder. His death says to us that we must work passionately, unrelentingly, to make the American dream a reality, so he did not die in vain.
And now we ask for an offering. One hoped-for goal of our church is to encourage all who gather here to grow more generous in spirit and in action. This is the great end of all the world's faith traditions, to bring the human being closer to the divine by acts of creation and compassion. We now are asked to make an offering that allows us to exercise that all-important generosity of spirit, an offering that will help support this self-supporting church and its many ministries. This morning, we share our gifts with the Malden Warming Center, whose mission is to serve those experiencing homelessness by providing safe shelter and warmth during the winter months, recognizing each person's inherent dignity and unique circumstance. The Malden Warming Center is our partner for the MLK Day of Service project. Here are the different ways you can donate. Those attending by live stream will soon see information about how to give. Those in the sanctuary may give checks, cash, or donate electronically. You may see this on our website's giving page, how to do this, or in your order of service. If you are visiting for the first time, either in person or online, you are our guest. The most valuable thing you can offer at this moment is your contact information so that we may stay connected beyond this Sunday. The offering will now be generously given and gratefully received. Those who wish to do so are invited to join in the unison affirmation. We gather not for ourselves alone, but to use our common power to build the beloved community within and beyond these walls. We create and reaffirm this covenant this day to make justice flourish, to practice compassion amidst difference, and to embody transformative love.
We close our and begin the rededication of our Black Lives Matter banner with a blessing drawn from the words of James Reeb. May we participate in the continuous creation of a vision that inspires people to noble and courageous living. May we share actively in the adventure of trying to forge spiritual